They say the West was won by grit and gunpowder, but it was fed by beans, salt pork, and desperation. The real foods that kept the Wild West alive. The fire burned low because fuel was precious, and the woman tending it knew the difference between warmth that lasted and warmth that lied. Her name was Sarah Clemens, and she had learned frontier cooking the way most learned it, through hunger that taught better than any recipe book, through winters that punished waste, through miles that demanded food light enough to carry and dense enough to keep a body upright when the trail wanted it horizontal. The pot above the flames held beans, because beans were the arithmetic of survival. They were cheap when you had coin, tradable when you didn't, and patient in ways fresh food never was. A sack of pintos could ride 1,000 miles in a wagon without complaint, swelling to triple their size when finally given water and heat, turning hard as gravel into something that filled bellies and bought another day. She had started them the night before, covering them with creek water in a Dutch oven that had crossed 3 territories with her. Now they simmered with salt pork, the fatty meat rendering into the beans, turning simple legumes into something that carried enough substance to fuel fence mending, wood splitting, the endless labor that kept homesteads from sliding back into the indifferent earth that barely tolerated human ambition. Salt pork, currency of the hungry. Fat was life, and this was gold you could chew. The strips hung in the smokehouse like currency because that's what they were. When a hog was slaughtered, every piece mattered. The belly meat was packed in salt so dense it burned the tongue if you weren't careful, preserving the flesh for months, sometimes a year if kept cool and dry. Sarah cut it thick, let the strips render in the skillet until the fat ran clear and the meat crisped at the edges, the smell so rich it made her daughter stop her schoolwork and drift toward the stove like a pup following scent. Salt pork fried with beans, salt pork with cornmeal mush, salt pork rendered into fat for biscuits when butter was a memory from back east. It wasn't delicate. It was survival wrapped in pig fat, and it kept people alive when nothing else would. Sourdough wasn't a recipe. It was a lineage, passed from woman to woman, a living promise that tomorrow might taste like today. The bread cooling on the table was sourdough, the starter older than Sarah's marriage. She'd been given it by a woman in a wagon train 7 years back, passed hand to hand like an heirloom, because that's what it was. The starter lived in a crock near the stove, fed with flour and water, bubbling slow and patient, turning flour into something with texture and tang that hardtack could never match. Sarah had baked this loaf in the Dutch oven buried in coals, the cast iron holding heat so even the crust came out golden and the inside stayed soft enough to tear. Sourdough required time, time for the starter to wake, time for dough to rise, and out here, time was measured against everything else that needed doing. But bread like this was worth it. It was the difference between eating to survive and eating to remember you were human. If you're still with me, learning how our ancestors turned scarcity into sustenance, do me a favor, hit that like button and subscribe. These stories take days of research to craft right. Back to the frontier table, where every meal was a negotiation with hardship. Cornbread came easier. Cornmeal kept almost as well as beans, and it asked for less. Sarah mixed it with water, salt, a bit of that precious rendered pork fat, and baked it in the skillet until the edges crisped dark, and the center held together just firm enough to break clean. No rising time, no starter to maintain, just meal to bread in the time it took the oven to heat. The children ate it with molasses, when there was molasses, or with beans spooned over top, the crumbling bread soaking up pot liquor like it was designed for exactly that purpose. Because it was. Cornbread was frontier pragmatism in edible form. But there were times when even cornbread was luxury. When the wagon was 3 days from the next supply post, and the flour had run out, and the beans were being rationed, that's when hardtack came out. The men riding the cattle trails carried it in sacks, those flat, thick biscuits baked so dry and hard they could survive anything. Rain, heat, years if necessary. Hardtack was flour, water, salt, baked until all moisture died. It kept indefinitely because nothing could live in it, not even the weevils that infested everything else, though they tried. Cowboys called it tooth dullers and sheet iron, and broke it with rifle butts before trying to chew it. Sarah had seen men soak hardtack in coffee until it softened enough to gum, had watched them fry it in bacon grease to make it almost palatable. It wasn't food meant to satisfy. It was food meant to prevent death, and it did that job without complaint or flavor. Coffee wasn't luxury. It was identity. Morning started when the pot boiled. Coffee was the one luxury no one compromised on, even when everything else ran short. The beans came green, roasted in skillets over open flame until they darkened and cracked, filling the air with smell that made even exhaustion sit up and pay attention. Sarah ground hers with a hand mill, the motion repetitive and meditative, then boiled the grounds in a pot until the liquid came out thick and black as river mud. No cream, no sugar, unless someone had just come from town. Just coffee, strong enough to stand a spoon in, served in tin cups that burned fingers, but no one cared because coffee was the thing that marked morning from night, that gathered people around the fire, that made another day of brutal labor seem possible. Cowboys boiled it on the trail until it could dissolve spurs. Homesteaders rationed it like gold, and when it ran out, they roasted chicory root or dandelions or grain, desperate for anything that tasted like the memory of real coffee. Pemmican was genius, born long before settlers arrived. Survival science in every ounce. Dried beef hung next to the salt pork, strips of meat cut thin and dried until they turned dark and hard. Jerky. It was made from whatever could be hunted: deer, elk, buffalo, back when buffalo still darkened the plains. The meat was sliced with the grain, salted heavy, sometimes rubbed with pepper if there was pepper, then hung in the smoke or laid in the sun until moisture abandoned it entirely. Jerky was food you could carry in your pocket, chew while riding, eat without fire or preparation. It lasted months, saved lives. Sarah's husband kept strips in his saddlebag, and more than once they'd turned a bad hunting day into a survivable one. The Shoshone woman who traded with Sarah once a month had shown her pemmican, though Sarah's version never quite matched. Pemmican was dried meat pounded to powder, mixed with rendered fat and sometimes berries, pressed into cakes that contained more nutrition per ounce than anything else the frontier offered. It was indigenous genius, adapted by trappers and traders who learned fast that European food couldn't survive mountain winters. Sarah tried making it with venison and bear fat, but it came out either too dry or too greasy, never quite the dense perfection the Shoshone woman produced. Still, even imperfect pemmican meant portable calories when the trail stretched long between meals. Nothing wasted, every part used. Frontier stew wasn't about flavor, it was about refusing to die. The stew bubbling for supper was what the Cowboys called son of a gun stew, though Sarah's version was cleaner than what the trail cooks made. Theirs included everything that came out of a butchered calf: heart, liver, tongue, brains, sweetbreads, kidneys, tripe, simmered with whatever vegetables could be found, if any. Nothing wasted, every organ put to use. Sarah's stew was simpler: beef chunks, potatoes when she had them, onions from the garden, carrots if the season was right. It cooked slow, low, the meat turning tender over hours, the vegetables breaking down into thickener. One pot that fed 6 people, with enough left over for tomorrow's breakfast if they were careful. Sow belly was what the railroad workers lived on, different from salt pork only in how it was cut and cured. Fattier, cheaper, capable of being fried into something crispy or boiled into submission. It showed up in logging camps, mining towns, anywhere men worked brutal hours for little pay. Sarah bought it when money was particularly tight, rendered the fat for cooking, fried the meat for flavor. It wasn't choice. It was available, and availability mattered more than preference when feeding a family through winter. Wild game came when hunting went well. Rabbit stewed with whatever vegetables the season offered. Venison roasted on spits or cut into steaks and fried in pork fat. Buffalo, back in her father's time, before the herds were slaughtered into near extinction, providing meat so plentiful entire tribes could winter on it. Sarah's husband brought home rabbits most often, small, quick, abundant enough that a decent shot could bag 3 or 4 in an evening. She skinned them with practiced efficiency, jointed them, put them in the pot with water and salt and whatever else she could spare. The meat was lean, which meant it needed fat added. More salt pork, more bacon grease, the frontier always circling back to pig fat as the answer to nearly every culinary problem. Bacon was a holiday. Bacon grease was a currency. Bacon deserved its own consideration, distinct from salt pork in the minds of those who cooked it, though the difference was subtle. Bacon was cured with sugar and spices when there were spices, smoked longer, cut thinner. It fried crisper, tasted sweeter, cost more. Sarah bought it rarely, saving it for mornings when her husband faced particularly brutal work, when the extra richness might give him an edge against the day. She laid the strips in the cold skillet, let them heat slow, so the fat rendered without burning, flipped them once, drained them on brown paper that would later be used to start fires because nothing got wasted. The grease stayed in the pan, used to fry eggs when the hens were laying, or potatoes, or to flavor beans. Bacon grease was liquid gold, stored in a tin near the stove, spooned into nearly everything. Eggs came seasonal. Winter meant the hens stopped laying, their bodies conserving energy against cold. Spring brought abundance, sometimes 8 or 10 eggs a day from the 6 hens Sarah kept. She fried them in bacon grease, the edges getting lacy and crisp. Scrambled them with wild onions she'd foraged, boiled them for the children to take when they walked to the neighbor's place, pickled them in vinegar and beet juice when the laying got ahead of the eating, storing them in crocks for leaner months. A fresh egg was luxury. A pickled egg was foresight.
Out here, delicacy was just another word for necessity. You ate what the land gave, or you went hungry.
Wild greens appeared in spring, like answered prayers. Dandelion leaves before they turned bitter. Lamb's quarters growing in disturbed soil near the garden. Purslane spreading low and succulent. Miner's lettuce in shaded draws. Sarah gathered them in her apron, picked them clean of dirt and insects, boiled them with salt pork until they wilted dark and tender. They tasted of earth and desperation, and relief that winter hadn't killed everything. The children complained about the bitterness until Sarah reminded them with a look that these greens carried medicine, iron that fought the pallor of winter, vitamins that healed the small cuts that wouldn't close, fiber that made bodies work right after months of dried food. You ate them not because they pleased, but because they healed. Prairie oysters arrived when castration season came. a fact Sarah's daughter was still too young to understand, but would learn soon enough. The testicles from bull calves, sliced, breaded in cornmeal, fried hot and fast. The Cowboys ate them with ceremony and crude jokes, but they were food, protein that would otherwise go to waste. Sarah fried them when her husband brought them home, serving them without comment, because out here, delicacy about food source was a luxury no one could afford. A can of peaches was more than food. It was proof that summer still existed somewhere. The canned goods on the shelf were treasure. Peaches in heavy syrup, tomatoes packed in their own juice, condensed milk in tins that required a knife to open. Canning had transformed frontier eating, letting people keep summer through winter, bringing fruit to places fruit had no business being. But cans cost money, and money was always scarce, so they sat on the shelf like reserves, opened for occasions or emergencies. When Sarah's son ran fever last winter, she'd opened tomatoes and made soup thin enough to spoon past his cracked lips. When her daughter's birthday came, peaches made it feel like celebration. The empty cans got saved, repurposed into cups, planters, repairs for whatever needed metal, shaped into usefulness. Molasses was sweetness for the working class, heavy, dark, and slow, like the days themselves. Molasses moved like dark thought, thick and slow from the jug. It sweetened cornbread, made beans almost luxurious, went into the rare cake when eggs and celebration aligned. Sugar was expensive, honey required finding bees, but molasses was working-class sweetness, strong-flavored, unrefined, cheap enough to buy in quantity. Sarah poured it over morning biscuits, let it seep into the flour, turning breakfast into something her children didn't have to be forced to eat. It wasn't maple syrup from back east. It was survival with a sweet edge. Cornmeal mush was breakfast when there wasn't time or supplies for anything else. Cornmeal boiled in water until it thickened, salted, served hot or left to cool and then sliced and fried in bacon grease. It sat heavy in the stomach, fuel for bodies about to spend 12 hours working. The children complained sometimes until Sarah reminded them with silence that complaining didn't summon better food, just wasted energy they'd need for chores. They learned to eat their mush without comment, sometimes with molasses, sometimes with milk if the cow was producing, mostly with salt and the understanding that lunch was hours away. The frontier didn't need abundance, it needed sustenance that stayed. Potatoes didn't spoil. Gravy made everything edible. Potato. When the crop came in, they stored hundreds in the cellar, layered in straw, checked weekly for rot. Potatoes boiled, fried, mashed, roasted in coals, added to stew, stretched into meals when meat ran short. They were Irish survival food, brought to the American frontier, planted in May, harvested in September, carried through winter as ballast against hunger. Sarah's father used to say potatoes and salt pork could keep a family alive indefinitely, and he wasn't wrong. They'd done it for 2 winters when drought took everything else. Biscuits appeared on better mornings, when there was flour and lard and time to work the dough. Sarah cut the lard into flour with her fingers, working it until the mixture looked like coarse meal, then added buttermilk if she had it, water if she didn't. She rolled the dough thin, cut circles with the rim of a cup, baked them in a hot oven until they rose tall and golden. Biscuits split open and filled with bacon. Biscuits soaked in gravy made from pan drippings and flour. Biscuits cold the next day, still good, still filling. They were Southern food, adapted to Western need, comfort disguised as practicality. Gravy deserved mention on its own, that thick, rich sauce made from meat drippings, flour, and milk when there was milk, water when there wasn't. It transformed biscuits from adequate to satisfying, made tough meat edible, stretched flavor across a meal. Sarah made it after frying bacon or venison, scraping the browned bits from the pan, whisking in flour until it smelled nutty, then adding liquid slowly until it thickened to the right consistency. Gravy was alchemy, turning fat and flour into something that made children clean their plates without being told. Rice showed up less often, more expensive than cornmeal, more delicate in cooking. But when Sarah could get it, she made pudding. Rice boiled in milk, with sugar and cinnamon if there was any, vanilla if she'd managed to trade for it. Rice pudding was special occasion food, the kind of thing that marked Christmas or a child's recovery from illness. The rest of the time, rice got added to soup, stretched stew, became another way to fill bellies with something beyond beans and meat. Vinegar pie wasn't dessert. It was rebellion, a reminder that even despair could taste like triumph. Vinegar pie emerged from absolute desperation. When there were no apples, no fruit, no fresh anything, women made pies from what wouldn't spoil: vinegar, water, sugar, eggs if there were eggs, flour for crust. The acid mimicked fruit tang. The sugar fought the pucker. It wasn't good, but it was pie-shaped. And sometimes the shape of a thing mattered as much as the substance. Sarah had made it twice, both times during winter when the cellar had run thin, and making something that looked like dessert felt like defiance against the cold trying to kill them. Lard was more than cooking fat. It was infrastructure. Rendered from pig fat, strained through cloth, stored in crocks, it made biscuits flaky, pie crust tender, fried foods crisp. Sarah kept two kinds: leaf lard from around the kidneys, pure white and mild, used for pastries, and regular lard from back fat, stronger flavored, used for frying and daily cooking. Rendering day filled the house with smell that took days to fade, but the crocks of white fat it produced were worth the lingering stench. Lard kept through winter in the cellar. It traveled without spoiling. It answered questions butter couldn't afford to be asked. Game birds came in fall when migration brought them through: ducks, geese, prairie chickens, quail if you were lucky. Sarah's husband brought them home plucked and gutted, and she roasted them whole or cut them into pieces for stew. The meat was dark and rich, gamey in ways domestic chicken never was. She saved the fat, rendered it like pork fat, used it to fry potatoes that tasted of wild places. The bones went into stock that became soup that fed them for days. Nothing wasted, nothing taken for granted. Onions from the garden hung in braids from the rafters, papery skins rustling when wind found the cracks in the walls. They went into everything: stews, soups, fried with meat, raw when someone was sick, because onions fought fever and infection. Sarah planted them each spring, tiny sets that swelled underground through summer, pulled before first frost, cured in the sun until the tops withered. They kept through winter if stored right, sprouting only near the end when spring announced itself and planting season came around again. The milk cow was temperamental, giving generously some seasons, barely at all others. When she gave, Sarah made butter. Cream skimmed and churned until it separated, the butter washed and salted and pressed into crocks. Buttermilk stayed behind, slightly sour, used for biscuits and drinking when the children's stomachs troubled them. Fresh butter was luxury spread thin on sourdough, saved for occasions. Salted butter kept longer, transported better, ended up in cooking more often than on bread. The cow also meant fresh milk for coffee, for cooking, for the children to drink when they were small. When she dried up, they made do with condensed milk from cans, mixing it with water until it approximated the real thing, fooling no one but functioning adequately. And whiskey. Not food, but sustenance nonetheless. Used for sterilizing wounds, numbing toothaches, making exhaustion bearable, warming bodies when cold bit deep. The men kept it in flasks, the women kept it in cupboards marked medicinal, and everyone understood it served purposes beyond recreational. Sarah used it to clean the knife before cutting into her son's infected finger. Her husband took a swallow before setting his own broken toe. The doctor in town prescribed it for everything from coughs to childbirth pain. It was dangerous and necessary, like most things on the frontier.
This was the arithmetic of survival. Beans, salt pork, and the quiet pride of another day endured. The table Sarah set each evening wasn't abundant. It was strategic. Beans for protein and bulk, salt pork for fat and flavor, cornbread to soak up pot liquor, coffee to mark the meal as human rather than animal feeding, sometimes dried apples stewed soft, sometimes molasses to sweeten the monotony, never enough variety to get bored, never scarce enough to panic. She'd learned to cook this way not from her mother, who died inside of the Mississippi, never making it west, but from necessity, from other women encountered on trails and in settlements, from trial and error that sometimes meant wasted food they couldn't afford to waste. She'd learned that sourdough starter was more valuable than jewelry. That salt pork answered most questions about flavor. That coffee mattered more than comfort. That food out here wasn't about pleasure, it was about making it to spring. Her daughter would learn the same lesson. Already she knew how to tend beans so they didn't scorch, how to cut salt pork thin so it went further, how to stretch cornmeal by mixing it with wheat flour when there was wheat flour. She knew hardtack meant someone was traveling, that canned peaches meant occasion, that whiskey in the daytime meant pain beyond normal. The foods that sustained the frontier weren't chosen for taste. They were chosen for survival arithmetic. Cost, weight, durability, nutrition per ounce, ability to withstand heat and cold and time. Beans, because they lasted. Salt pork, because fat was life. Cornmeal, because it didn't need yeast. Coffee, because mornings without it felt impossible. Dried meat, because fresh meat spoiled. Canned goods, because summer couldn't last. Molasses, because sweetness reminded bodies they were more than work machines. Potatoes, because they grew even when other things wouldn't. Every meal was negotiation between hunger and supplies, between desire and availability, between the food they remembered from back east and the food that actually kept them alive out here, where the land was beautiful and brutal and completely indifferent to human need. Sarah pulled the cornbread from the oven, the crust dark gold, the smell filling the cabin. She ladled beans into bowls, set salt pork on a plate, poured coffee into cups that had come from 3 different places and no longer matched. Her husband came in from the field, dirt under his nails, exhaustion in his shoulders. Her children washed hands at the basin. They sat. This was frontier dining. No linens, no courses, no pretense that food was entertainment, just fuel, served in portions calculated to carry bodies through tomorrow's labor, seasoned with salt and necessity, the quiet pride that they'd made it through another day. The beans were good because Sarah knew the timing. The salt pork was crisp because she'd learned heat management in a stove that had no temperature gauge, just experience and attention. The cornbread crumbled exactly right because she'd made it 1,000 times, adjusting for altitude and humidity and the particular temperament of the cornmeal batch. Her husband ate without comment, which was approval. Her children cleaned their bowls, which was survival. Sarah poured herself coffee, let the bitter heat slide down her throat, felt her body register the caffeine like a promise that sleep could wait a few more hours. Outside, the frontier pressed close, wind and distant isolation. Inside, the stove ticked as it cooled, the lamp made shadows dance, and 5 people digested food that would become energy, that would become work, that would become survival, that would come, if they were lucky and stubborn enough, something they could eventually call home. The foods of the Old West weren't cuisine. They were a language of endurance, spoken in beans and salt pork and coffee strong enough to wake the dead. Every bite was a calculation. Every meal was a victory against odds stacked high as mountains. Sarah cleared the bowls, scraped the pot, Set beans aside for tomorrow. Nothing wasted, nothing taken for granted. The sourdough starter bubbled near the stove, patient and live, ready to turn more flour into bread when bread was needed. The salt pork hung in the smokehouse, waiting to flavor the next meal and the next until it was gone, and they'd slaughter another hog and begin again. This was how the West was fed, not with abundance, but with knowledge earned hard, passed woman to woman, written in no cookbook, but practiced daily until it became instinct. The arithmetic of beans, the salvation of salt pork, the democracy of cornbread that tasted the same whether you were cattle baron or homesteader, the luxury of coffee, the preservation of dried meat, the insurance of canned goods, the defiance of vinegar pie when there was nothing else to make pie from, and through it all, the understanding that food out here wasn't separate from the survival. It was survival, measured in mouthfuls, stretched across seasons, rationed through winters, celebrated when harvest came good. Sarah banked the fire for the night, leaving just enough coals to kindle morning without wasting matches. The children were already asleep. Her husband sat whittling by a lamplight, making something useful from something that had been tree. She sat beside him with her knitting, needle pulling thread through fabric that needed another season of wear. Tomorrow she'd make biscuits with the sourdough starter, fry more salt pork, put beans on to soak for the day after, check the potatoes in the cellar, ration the canned peaches, grind more coffee, render more fat, plan more meals with the supplies that remained, calculating how long they'd stretch, what needed buying when they could get to town, what could be traded for or done without. The foods that sustained the frontier sustained them still, morning after morning, meal after meal, season after season. Not because they were easy or delicious, but because they worked. These simple, sturdy, stubborn foods that tasted like survival and smelled like home and kept bodies alive through conditions that would have killed softer people eating softer food. Sarah finished her mending, trimmed the lamp, followed her family into sleep. Tomorrow would bring the same foods in different combinations, the same careful stretching of supply, the same gratitude for beans that held, salt pork that flavored, cornbread that filled, coffee that fortified. This was the feast of the frontier, and it was enough.